All right, so now this is the next evolution in the 1960s. This is the RS6 radio. We have one of these, well, I'll get to it. It's in the California Historical Radio Society Museum. And it's a very, very interesting, very, very compact set. This is the receiver. This is the transmitter. There's a power supply, and this is sort of a power regulator. And in the California Historical Radio Society, we have these two pieces, but we don't have those two pieces. But this has in it the sub-miniature tubes. So that they may have first been developed for hearing aid use in the late 1930s. They're very small, they're very rugged. And keep in mind that in the 1940s, one of the most important weapons that we had in the Second World War was the proximity fuse, because it made it possible to shoot things down in the sky relatively easily, because the shell would get near or approximately close to an airplane and then would blow up and the airplane would fall down. Now, the proximity fuse had a little radar transmitter in it. And so the shell itself is a radar transmitter and receiver, and as it goes nearer and nearer to the aircraft, it's getting the reflection back, and when it gets close enough, it blows up. Well, that had vacuum tubes in it. So we're talking about vacuum tubes that are literally shot out of guns on these anti-aircraft guns. And each of these shells had a little radio transmitter in the tip, which was its trigger. So these vacuum tubes were extraordinarily rugged. I mean, think of the G-forces that come out of a 75 millimeter shell out of a cannon. You know, these things were very, very rugged, and they had a very good reliability rate. So we're using, they weren't necessarily the same tubes, but it's the same rugged style of vacuum tube being used in the RS6. Now here's the receiver, a better shot of the receiver. And this particular one, this is now at the CHRS Museum, and Denny Monticelli restored it for us. But this particular receiver has got it's a very odd sequence because it's got the double X and whatnot. We don't actually know a lot about what happened with these. But when we think about the RS1, which is the earlier version, and then the RS6, a lot of these were made, and there's some, we know that the RS6, for example, went into, can we go back one? Went into the Strategic Air Command. So at least on the B-47, beneath the ejection seat, there was one of these radios. So the idea was that the B-47s are going to go nuke Moscow or something, but they can't get back. So the pilots were told, well, that's okay, because what you'll do is you'll eject when you run out of fuel, and then you'll land in Siberia, and you'll take your radio out, okay, and you'll tell us where you are, and we'll come get you. Now this is true optimism, all right? But anyway, this is the story that the way this was used in the Strategic Air Command, and they certainly were under some of these ejection seats. But there weren't that many B-47s. There was an awful lot of these radios. So they're also used by special forces. Now, special forces in the 50s and in the 60s, before Vietnam, almost exclusively focused on Europe. And the idea was that the Russians are going to sweep to the coast, and it's going to be just like the Germans and the Nazis in the Second World War, except this time we're going to be ready for them because we're going to have special forces operations all over the place, and we're going to have what are called leave-behind caches. And so we're going to have things buried all over Western Europe that contain radio sets and gold coins and guns and ammunition and, you know, whatever this and that. And so when the special forces guys go back to link up with the supposed partisans, they're going to know where all this stuff is, and we'll be able to dig it out of the ground and go to work. So there's some speculation that a lot of these radios were were actually used as leave-behind radios. We also know that the Soviets did that in East Germany and other places, and sometimes in Western countries, that they buried caches including the equivalent of the RS1. At least one of them has been dug up and photographed. And so this was something that went on. So we don't know where all these radios ended up. An awful lot of them were used in special forces. And some of them were then put into the hands of Mars operators, the military affiliated radio system, and the Civil Air Patrol. And they sort of move from there into some civilian and amateur radio uses. Now, this particular radio had something that's very rare. It actually had the instruction cards with the radio. So that's what these cards are. And at some point, I want to get these, blown up and posted on the internet, because they are very rare. But you can see the configuration. There's the receiver, there's the transmitter, there's the power supply, there's the power regulator. Now, this is also a SPY radio. And again, the contrast isn't so great, but this is a Panasonic shortwave receiver from the mid-'80s. And this was actually used by spies. Unfortunately, they were spying on us. And this is the radio that was used by the man and his wife in the State Department, who had been Cuban spies almost from the beginning in the early 1960s. Now, this is not a transmitter. This is a receiver. So we go back to the civilian circuits, and the way this worked is that the Cubans, the Russians through the Cubans, would broadcast numbers. That's all they are, numbers. I'm sure many of you in shortwave radios have heard the numbers broadcasts. They're still on, by the way. They're still going on, and there are five number groups out of Cuba. They're Spanish, Atención, or whatever. And this is a really effective way to communicate with people in the field, because they're not sending anything back. They're just getting their instructions, and they have one-time pads. Now, I can't tell you the limits of what the National Security Agency can do, but I can tell you that a one-time pad is extremely difficult to decipher, because it's just every little page is a completely new encryption system. Now, in the Second World War, the Russians were using a one-time pad system for their diplomatic cables from the United States back to the Soviet Union. And somebody in Russia made a mistake, and they duplicated the one-time pads. And the Army Security Agency caught that. And as a result of that duplication, they were able to break the Russian diplomatic traffic, which is known as the Venona intercepts. And it was the Russians in the United States telling the Russians back in Russia who the American spies were and what they were doing, which pretty much resolves the issue of whether Alger Hiss was a Russian spy or not. The Venona traffic is a fascinating set of messages, and there's a book called The Venona Traffic. But the Cubans, as far as we know, as far as I know, never made that mistake. They didn't duplicate the one-time pads. And so the numbers broadcasts are coming over, and people are listening to them on this little radio. And now again, if you know that this radio is radiating from its local oscillator, and you're driving around and you're listening 455 kilohertz down, assuming that that's what the IF is on this radio, or up rather. So you hear the local oscillator and you go up, and sure enough, what you hear on the frequency, 455 kilohertz above the local oscillator, is the Cuban numbers broadcast. Well, you've got a clue that this guy is listening to the Cuban numbers broadcast. So sometimes you only get one clue. And so it would have been possible to track it down this way. So how do we ultimately deal with these guys? Well, incidentally, you remember the 10 Russian spies that we just caught and sent to Russia to get our spies back? 10 for 3. I thought, we should get some more people. But anyway, so we gave them back. They were also using one-time pads, and they were also using shortwave radios, just like this, just commercial shortwave radios. Probably a little bit better than the 1983 Panasonic, but that's what they were using. And so they were getting instructions, again, out of Cuba from the Cuban numbers transmissions. But the FBI dealt with that in a fairly straightforward way. They just burgled their apartments and houses and got the messages, and then left and didn't leave any clue that they'd been there. So they basically had all the traffic. They weren't going through any of this complicated mathematical algorithm, hypercomputer decryption stuff. They were just going in and stealing it, which is their job. So the one-time pad system actually still is still in use. The numbers broadcasts are still in use, and there are still, as far as we know, spies that are listening on commercial civilian gear and getting their instructions from Cuba. I think the idea that this is the last 10 Russian spies is fatuous. I wouldn't be surprised at least another 100 of them out there somewhere. All right, and I'm very careful never to listen to the Cuban number station on a superhead. I don't need the heat. Next. Well, what have we here? Some of you may have seen The Simpsons on TV. It's actually the only TV show I've ever liked in the last 25 years. And it's a great, great comedic odyssey, The Simpsons. Well, early on, well, you know, Homer Simpson, my hero, Homer Simpson works in a nuclear power plant. And, you know, he eats a lot of donuts and he's not paying attention to the meters. If you've watched The Simpsons, you may have noticed this, all right? And I think it's Mr. Burns' power plant, if I'm not mistaken. And there's a little three-eyed fish in the pond out there from the radiation and stuff like that. Well, so what happens here is Bart, my namesake, okay, he gets into some kind of mischief and he's sent to Albania. You know, it's sort of a punishment, but it becomes an Albanian exchange student thing. And so an Albanian student comes to live with the Simpsons. And he's very, very interested in what Homer does at the atomic power plant. And, you know, and he's a radio kid, like many of us are, all right? Well, it turns out that he is a spy. And here is his midget radio. And he is sending back to Albania, remember this is 1990, okay? He's sending back to Albania the information about what Homer is doing here. All right, so that's what I could figure out, the relationship between midget radios and spy radios. So if somebody in the back could hit at least one of the lights, that would be good. And could somebody find a light switch back there? Yeah, any old light switch will do. Or maybe somebody knows where they are here. Yeah, that's it. Yeah, we just need one. All right, so thank you very much. You've been a very attentive audience, and I appreciate it. I'll take any questions you want.